Thank you very much. First, let me express my thanks to Julie and to the organizers at the Asia Institute at York, and particularly under the umbrella of the Canada-ASEAN Initiatives, on which this seminar is being held. My role is really just to try and set the stage without preempting the wisdom and insights that our participants will have to offer by providing some context. And many of you, both physically present and joining online, are already fully aware of the growing importance of the Indo-Pacific region. It's generally understood, while each country and the EU have their own precise definitions, that when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, we're talking about a region that comprises what traditionally has been called the Asia-Pacific area, plus maritime South Asia, and the Indian Ocean. And it's not an overstatement to suggest that we are seeing unfolding what you might call the Indo-Pacific century, because we're seeing a major shift of global economic and strategic weight towards this region. If you take the region as I described, from the Western Pacific through the Indian Ocean to India, this region comprises more than 60%, that's almost 2/3 of global GDP. 3 of the 5 largest economies in the world, China, India, and Japan. But on the other hand, over half of global greenhouse gas emissions. You also have in this region 65%, 2/3 of the global population, but that comprises a very heterogeneous mix. About 37% of the world's poorest people are in this region. On the other hand, and Kevin may correct me with his numbers, but most predictions anticipate that about 60% of the global middle class will be found in this region by 2030. So developments in this region, for better or for worse, will determine the pace and the success of global recovery coming out of COVID. And the terms on which this region engage with each other and with the rest of the world will, in effect, define how well we're doing in coming to grips with a globalized world. We know we're witnessing geopolitical competition now and for the foreseeable future, and that in turn fuels tensions on trade, on technology, and even on appropriate models for development and sustainable development. And as Julie noted in her introduction, Canada's own interests are implicated. Why? Because a region that is at peace, that promotes sustainable development for its own citizens, that creates jobs and growth, becomes an ever more important partner for continued development, for tackling shared issues like climate change and sustainable oceans alongside. But a region that would be characterized by internal divisions, by inequality within countries, can create and cause civil strife, can destabilize governments, can invite domestic terrorism with spillover effects on borders, and again, combined with geostrategic objectives, a region that is full of tension and dissatisfaction and exclusion will not come to grips with its own challenges of development, of an environment and a climate that's hospitable to citizenry, and thus deprives Canada not only of customers or of trade opportunities, but can destabilize the global environment. So this session is billed as focused on trade and investment, number one, and focused on the ASEAN region in particular. Number two, we often hear about ASEAN centrality. Why? Because increasingly, ASEAN countries are integrated ever more in a regional supply chain-based economy, because they are in the crossroads of patterns of traffic, whether maritime, land, or air, that affect not only trade, but again, security. And because they all within ASEAN profess to want to maintain good relations with all the major powers. And thus, whether ASEAN, to some extent, as a region, will determine to some extent whether the Indo-Pacific and Indo-Pacific with the rest of the world. But let me just remind, in addition to the high-tier economies, largest economies that I mentioned, and the richness you find in South Korea and Singapore as well in terms of per capita income, ASEAN is also host to some of the poorest countries in the world: Cambodia, Myanmar, the Lao Republic as well. And again, these are countries that are further from the path of creating a middle class that is creating jobs and participation in the economy, and thus a comprehensive approach that the speech from the throne suggests that Canada wants to try and develop in common with other allies would comprise a contribution, which we're already doing to some extent through our military and intelligence services, to the security of the region, number one. Number two, robust engagement on trade and economic affairs, and Julie already referred to that with the launch of Canada-ASEAN negotiations. And I should add that the government has invited public consultations and views on superimposing on that a further bilateral trade negotiation with Indonesia, a true pillar, important in ASEAN. Of course, our membership in CPTPP and our pre-existing free trade agreement with and our active member in APEX, got security. You've got a pre-inherited but maybe accelerated trade and investment agenda. And I would add the development dimension as fundamentally important. Our technical assistance, our international assistance, foreign aid as it's called popularly, is sprinkled throughout the region. Under our feminist international development policy, we do try and put priority on increasing women's participation in the economy and providing the basics of for maternal and child health and nutrition in order to create the conditions for broader participation. In these times of constrained budgets, where a lot of money is going to humanitarian and immediate needs as well as COVID, I hesitate to predict what budget 2022 might provide in terms of foreign assistance, but it's recognized that the sustainability of countries does require on some basic investments on the social side, and I've already mentioned on the climate side as well. And the Government of Canada has announced in connection with COP a top-up of its $5 billion over 10 years to help this region as well as others address mitigation, adaptation, and enhance resilience to what we're seeing as the most disturbing pattern of climate change. So with that by way of context, I would like to turn things over to my namesake and to some extent my teacher and mentor as well, Jonathan Berkshire Miller. I could spend about a half hour highlighting not only his publications, but his affiliations, his recognition at home and abroad, in academic circles, public policy circles, and the media as well. He is sought after by policymakers within and beyond government for his insight and wisdom. He has lived and worked in Asia as well as in Canada. His affiliations similarly span the continents. As a distinguished fellow of the leading foreign policy think tank in Asia, the Japan Institute of International Affairs, for example, and here at home, he is the director of the Indo-Pacific program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, headquartered where I am, here in Ottawa. So with that, I'm going to turn to Jonathan as an avid listener and note taker, because I always benefit from his insights, his advice, and his wisdom. So Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much for that. And let me just echo, well, again, thank you to the audience who's tuning in virtually and to everyone who was able to come here in person. So I'm glad to be able to do this in person, to be able to have this interaction. What I'm going to focus on today, and again, I think Julie really had some excellent initial remarks in her sort of framing and the recent developments of how Canada is engaging in this region. We have really good news, obviously, about the launch of the Canada-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. And I'm going to give some of the heavy lifting and work on the trade and investment side to my colleague Kevin, and really excited to hear some of your remarks afterwards. But I'd like to focus on a couple different elements. First of it is this Indo-Pacific framing. And the second important part, and I think why a lot of us are here today, is ASEAN itself and where ASEAN fits into that Indo-Pacific framing. So I'm going to kind of call this an optimistic sandwich that you're going to get. So, you know, I'm going to start with a little bit of optimism, have quite a healthy amount of pessimism in the middle, and hopefully end optimistically as well. So let's begin. So thinking about the Indo-Pacific, I think Jonathan's right. You know, he mentioned and we don't need to sort of go into the reason of the why. Why are countries, including Canada, becoming more and more interested in the Indo-Pacific? I think for this crowd anyways, the answers are self-evident, whether they're in trade and investment terms, whether they're on the geopolitical, geostrategic security side. We know why we should be interested. I think that the how we sort of frame this is going to be one of the big questions. And I do think Jonathan and his colleagues in GAC, and not just, and I should mention, this is not just an effort that's happening in one department in Ottawa. I think this is something that is happening across government. And when thinking about the how and how we start thinking about our region, and I would include ASEAN in this, again, it's important, even the framing of Julie, for example, organizing this, is there are multiple stakeholders that plug in here. So to think that this is just one stakeholder at 125 Sussex is mistaken. Now, you know, it's not just on the government side. This is the private sector has a big role here. And one of the important things to think about, the Chambers of Commerce have been doing good work, obviously, for several decades across the region. But now we actually have a grouping of the Chambers of Commerce across the Indo-Pacific region that are talking in Indo-Pacific terms. So this is a really significant development. And when we think of a strategy, we have to get out of the temptation to think effectively this is designed, created, and implemented only by bureaucrats. This is something that will have it's the job for them to sort of develop this, but actually implementing this and making this successful is going to require adept collaboration between the bureaucracy, the political side, the private sector, even civil society as well. academics, think tanks, etc. So this is going to be sort of a whole of society effort if it's really going to be successful. Just very quickly on the most recent developments on the Indo-Pacific. So I think as Julie referenced the throne speech, it was really excellent to see the mentioning of the Indo-Pacific as a priority area next to the Arctic, which I think was significant. The Prime Minister has on multiple occasions noted his support for the free and open Indo-Pacific. And this has been something that has been agreed to in some sort of semblance through the G7 as well. So this is something that we've been out front on. This is not a new idea of whether we're going to be interested in the Indo-Pacific, whether this is a thing you can see if you, if you're tired on a rainy day and you want to have a nap, you can go through all the bilateral statements of the Minister of Foreign Affairs meetings, and you can see with a range of different colleagues, ranging from, of course, the obvious ones like the United States and Japan to the less obvious ones like Spain. We're referencing the Indo-Pacific as a priority area of cooperation. So this is a real thing. This is no longer an issue of debate. And the last point I want to make on this, and I get this question a lot, and I think is particularly important because we're talking about ASEAN today, is, I think Jonathan made a good description of what the Indo-Pacific is, but the difference between the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific. Are we no longer using Asia-Pacific? Is Asia-Pacific, you go into a boardroom in Global Affairs Canada or elsewhere and you use Asia-Pacific, people are like, no, you can't do that. We're talking Indo-Pacific now. And my answer to this, and I hope Jonathan would agree with me and maybe Kevin does as well, is that this is not the point. This misses the point. The Indo-Pacific is an important conceptual way to think about this region, but by no means is it intended to replace the Asia-Pacific. The reality is, even if you think of some of the multilateral architecture that Canada engages in and has been foundational to Canada's relations with this region, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, the Asian Development Bank, the ARF, the ASEAN-related forum. So we are, of course, going to continue to use Asia in our terminology, and this is not an either or. But I think what it is, and I think why it's important, is it's recognizing that the ways that we engage, the themes that we engage, and the thematic focus that we engaged in the last few decades was necessary but insufficient to meet the challenges of the day. And not talking purely in security terms. So I'm not saying this is not about how we mitigate, Chinese activities in the South China Sea or mitigate tensions over Taiwan or North Korea. More broadly, infrastructure, investment, trade, everything together. It's necessary but insufficient. We need to be much more creative. And this sort of getting a little bit into the sort of the pessimism side of the sandwich is, as I mentioned to some here already and before the discussion, frankly, time is not on our side. This is not something that we can look at from a Canadian perch, from our geography, and say, well, this is effectively a luxury item. Yes, we can invest in the region, get economic opportunities, but the geopolitical risks in this region are effectively going to be dealt with from our American friends, or they're going to be dealt with from our Asian partners, and we can plug in from time to time when it's necessary. The reality are these are our strategic interests, these are our strategic equities, and we're slowly realizing this. But as I said, time is of the urgency. And to sort of highlight this, even if you think in the G7 context, so there is when thinking about this region, whether it's in Indo-Pacific, and again, I wouldn't belabor too much on, stressing this point, but basically having a much more serious purpose on thinking about this region. In the G7, we have the Americans, obviously, and the Japanese, who are, the Japanese have been thinking about the Indo-Pacific for quite some time, almost 20 years. Abe Shinzo, when he went to the Indian Parliament in 2006-07 and mentioned the confluence of two seas. So this idea has been floating around a long time. And I think it's important to think about that, because I think there's also a perception that we had a mercurial president in 2016 in the United States and started talking about the free and open Indo-Pacific. And there were some sort of less informed narratives that essentially said the Americans are foisting on this new concept upon the whole world, and the goal is to contain China. And my answer to that is the reality is, number one, this wasn't an American concept. The Japanese have been thinking about this for some time. The Indians have been thinking about this for a lot of time. The Australians have been thinking about this. And then if you forward to today's world, and as I mentioned in the G7, we have Germany, which has its outlines for this region, for the Indo-Pacific. We have the UK, which has talked about this in its integrated defense review. France is focused increasing on this region as a strategy. ASEAN itself has an outlook for the Indo-Pacific, which I think is extremely significant and important that they've put that out as well. In addition to other players, the Dutch as well have outlined. So again, all of this to say is this reiterates or underlines my point that time is not on our side. I do think we will come out with and I'm optimistic that we will come out with a very strong strategy for this region that will not, by its nature, be identical to one, whether it's the Americans or by the Japanese, and that's okay. You know, Canada should have its own unique thumbprint on this, but a serious recognition of this being not a 1 year, not a 2 year, not a 5 year, 10-year tactical effort, but a long-term strategic lens to think about our foreign policy stakes, I think is really, really needed. So that's the general framing. I wanted to get into a little bit of where ASEAN fits into this, because I think this is at the crux as well, because I remember being at the Shangri-La Dialogue when in-person events were still a thing. And I think this might have been my last one in person when Narendra Modi was keynoting. And there was a lot of anxieties in the room among ASEAN colleagues when Modi was going to make a speech that maybe this was going to be the Quad, finally, the Quad being the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, this development of those 4 countries in an informal alignment way about security, but also thinking about issues such as sea diplomacy, infrastructure. There was a bit of anxiety that is great effectively saying that ASEAN and related bodies, which have been there forever, or at least in the post-war context have been there, are no longer effective, and effectively great powers are going to take over the strategic space. So there was this feeling and sort of tenseness in the room. And I think, I actually think Modi had, quite a masterclass of a speech, and was, number one, pitching to the audience, very much saying that ASEAN centrality is very important. And I think if you go back and read that speech, it's very important because it shows from the Indian perspective, but I think it just shows more broadly how countries in the region, and I think Japan has also done this as it's evolved its approach to the Indo-Pacific, is realizing that there is not only a space for ASEAN, but I think, as Jonathan mentioned in his initial remarks, ASEAN really is core to the way that even the great powers are thinking about this region. Is ASEAN a perfect body that can solve every problem? I think even those here today wouldn't agree with that, but that's not necessarily the point. ASEAN clearly is a necessary, but perhaps not sufficient mechanism to deal with these challenges. And this is why I think the significance of ASEAN coming out with its own outlook for the Indo-Pacific is there, because I think that's sort of a recognition of this. Again, does ASEAN agree with everything that's in the United States approach to the Indo-Pacific or even the other individual countries? Probably not. But I think some of the shared elements, if you look at the ASEAN strategy, do link up quite closely with Canadian interests and with interests of others in the region. So basically, all this to say is the region is changing. And not only are the great powers adapting to this and adapting to this very fast change, but ASEAN itself and member states within ASEAN are reacting as well. So I think that's and that leads me, I think, to the way we engage, and maybe Kevin can touch on this a bit more in the trade context. But I talk about vehicles of engagement. So you can think about this, when I talk about this, I think mainly in government terms, but I think you can think about this through other stakeholders too. The traditional vehicle of engagement that Canada has been most comfortable with, whether it's the Indo-Pacific region, whether it's the transatlantic theater, whether it's really anywhere globally, has been multilateralism. And again, no one's saying that we should pull out of multilateral fora, pull our money from the UN or get out of the ASEAN Regional Forum. But I think what I've been highlighting in the early parts of my talk is that number one, multilateralism at its heart is rich bilateral relationships, which makes it work. So in order for us to be effective in this region, I think we need to be doing three cars at the same time. One of them is enriching multilateral fora, whether that's ARF, Asian Development Bank, I think is extremely important and often underutilized. We're also a member of the AIIB in China, APEC, of course, as well. So the multilateral architecture is important, but don't forget about the bilateral relationships. Again, and I think this is important when we're talking about ASEAN, is that, of course, the FTA, I think, is great. But in the end, what is an FTA with a group like ASEAN? It's individual agreements with member states. So we need to keep a focus and an attention to nourish and enrich and find opportunities to engage with those key bilateral states. And as a short plug, again, for those who are on a rainy day and want to fall asleep quickly, no, I tell you, it's more exciting than this, but McDonald-Laurier Institute did a really great collaboration with Indonesia on this, talking about enriching that bilateral relationship, which I think is a very important one. So thinking about that in the bilateral context, but also how does that impact the broader relationship with ASEAN? So multilateral, bilateral, very important. The third one, I think, which is important, is what I would call mini-lateral. And in this sense, I'm not talking about Canada immediately saying, okay, we're number 5 on the Quad. Where can we deploy the Navy to contain China? I don't think that's sort of missing the point. The idea is that there's ways that we can hinge off key bilateral relationships to work a little bit more creatively. Not everything needs to be done through the multilateral fora or done in the sort of the bilateral straitjacket. And one relationship that I think really could be foundational for us on this, and we're farthest ahead when thinking about the Indo-Pacific, is Japan. So, for example, why not get creative and start thinking about Canada-Japan cooperation in ASEAN? Japan has immense equity and capital and diplomatic capital in its relationships in ASEAN. Whether Japan would be interested to do that, I think we maybe would need to do some convincing of what priorities we can focus on. But we have a framework now with Japan to do this, and this seems like a great opportunity. Another relationship that I think is underutilized in this context, and I've heard good things from the government side on their interest, is France. France is sort of still feeling uncomfortable after the AUKUS deal, obviously, with the Australians, the US, and the UK. And I don't say that this creates an opportunity or sort of a move for us to say, okay, well, France is a bit unhappy right now. Maybe we can move and get their attention and say, well, Canada, we can do things, whether it's in the Pacific or whether it's in ASEAN. But I think the France relationship is also underutilized in this context. We usually think about it in the Francophonie, in the Sahel. I think we have great cooperation with France, but why not in the Indo-Pacific? This also seems like a very fertile relationship to sort of take advantage of. So those are a couple ideas to think about. Very quickly to end, a little bit talking about trade, and then maybe that would be a nice segue to Kevin, is I think it's fantastic that we've now launched the trade agreement with ASEAN. The way that we need to think about this region, I've talked about it in the broader strategic scope of these vehicles of engagement, but I think this is true in trade as well. It's not like we have one trade agreement, Trans-Pacific Partnership, great high ambition trade agreement, game's over, close the books, we're in the clubs, so we can focus on other things. The reality is what I call the CPTPP is it's really a gate opener. You're at the stage now. But what do you do with it? So, perhaps Kevin can talk more about this. The engagement with the private sector, let them know exactly what the benefits are, the opportunities, how to utilize that. Again, going back to the bilateral relationships, which are crucial, especially in an agreement like TPP, where you don't have all of ASEAN members. How do you really make the best out of that agreement? The second thing on that, before I touch on the ASEAN deal, is that expansion is coming. And I think the TPP is in for, whether it's an interesting winter, geopolitics are swirling around the TPP now. I was speaking with the UK High Commission recently, and obviously they're first in line to accede. And I think it's a, relatively easier type of a session, especially I think related to Canadian interests and probably related to Japan and Australia too, or some of the big economies there. But the next stages are going to be challenging. We had the Chinese and the Taiwanese apply almost simultaneously. We kicked at a question time if you're interested. But I think that was done purely in an obstructionist sense. Are there those in the Chinese Communist Party who have a desire eventually to be part of an agreement like the TPP and make the economic reforms necessary? Probably. Is that a thought of reality in the next 15, 20 years, or was this move a pure power play to essentially box out Taiwan and make other countries in the TPP make those difficult decisions? I think it's the latter. So we have to be aware that this agreement, there's geopolitical storms around it. And as the second biggest economy right now in the TPP, we have to find a way to make sure that that doesn't sort of upset the apple cart. Last thing to note, the ASEAN deal I think is excellent. What I would say too, and I think it's going to demand a lot of attention, is don't forget about the bilateral relationships as well, though. That's important, but you're going to need a web of different sort of agreements. You can have 3 or 4 agreements. If you look at some of the most successful countries in trade, again, pointing to Japan as one who's had a huge FTA network in the region. They have multiple layers, whether it's bilateral, Japan-ASEAN FTA, RCEP, CPTPP. I mean, they have multiple sheets on the bed. And that's really what you need here in this region, is different ways to sort of link in. So again, amazing step, and it's going to create a lot of work. So I know there's only a limited amount of resources, but again, don't get your eye off of or take your eye off of the bilateral relationships and those opportunities, whether they're investment, whether they're FTAs as well. So I've spoken too much, but again, Julie, thank you so much for setting this up, and very much look forward to a discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Professor Nguyen. Thank you, Jonathan, and Jonathan, distinguished panelists. That was a tremendous overview. Very, very insightful. Thank you very much. I will take this opportunity to provide a brief overview of EDC, who we are, what we do, and most importantly, how EDC can help Canadian companies expanding into the ASEAN region take advantage of the opportunities that are plentiful. So Jonathan's overview, and I really like what you said about the gate opener of the free trade agreements, the macroeconomic arena, and where we are, and the vehicles of engagement. So if you could think of EDC as a vehicle of engagement between Canadian companies and companies in the Asian markets, and how we can help facilitate that. So EDC, we are Canada's export credit agency. This is our 75th year. We were established in 1944, coming to the end of the Second World War, when the world there was a lot going on. There was a lot of volatility, for obvious reasons, but a lot of opportunities as well to rebuild after a time that was quite unprecedented. And we see that we view ourselves as being in a similar time now, coming out of this most recent crisis, looking at the opportunities that are out there. EDC, we provide the two main pillars of EDC, one of which is to protect Canadian companies as they go out and take advantage and win new opportunities and contracts internationally. And number 2 is to finance that growth, so add capacity. And that is that's the foundation upon which we were established, and that is by and large what we continue to do today. So we're a Crown corporation, financially self-sustaining, providing financing solutions to both Canadian companies as well as international companies who are looking to buy from Canada. So keeping that in mind and looking to leverage EDC as you're going out and expanding into these new markets, those are the 2 main key things to recall of EDC. We are coast to coast in Canada. We have offices from east to west and north as well. And internationally, we This is our footprint globally. And for the Asian markets, our head office for the region is in Singapore. So it's a standalone office. We do our own underwriting. We have a significant team in Singapore, but we also have folks who are stationed within consulates within various countries in Asia, within the Asian region as well. So why is Southeast Asia important from a trade perspective? Canada has indeed benefited from its trade with Asian nations. Since 2000, growth in merchandise exports alone to Asian countries has increased at more than triple Canada's average growth to the rest of the world. In the past 5 years, with all its trade difficulties, growth has remained double the pace of exports elsewhere. Total Canadian investment interests in Asian nations have risen by 10% annually since 2013, accounting for just over 12 billion in 2019. Exports to Asian countries are fairly diversified as well. There's a three-way contest for top spot between wheat, pulp, and non-metallic minerals. Among top exports, food is a group that accounts for more than a quarter of the total activity in an area that's a key focus for EDC. With current growth ahead of the overall average of more than 10% annually. Exports to Asian countries are fairly diversified. Commodities dominate what Canada sends to Asian countries currently, but higher value add exports like machinery, pharmaceuticals sum up more than 14% of the total annual exports since 2000 and have grown by an average of more than 10% annually. Asian nations face a bright future. Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines often figure in the list of the next emerging top potential countries on the planet. Singapore maintains a regional mainstay as a global trade bellwether, and Cambodia, Laos have huge potential for fast expansion. Country by country, Canadian activities are mixed, but export growth is particularly strong in the fast four: Vietnam, the Philippines, and Cambodia. And average growth as well ahead of the pack, collectively topping 15% annually over the past 4 years and 9% annually since 2000. Collectively, they account for 32% of the Canada-ASEAN exports. That matches our share to Indonesia alone, a dominant destination, but one where performance has lagged in recent years. Investment is concentrated in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Singapore, which together account for 88% of Canadian ASEAN holdings. Despite the checkered Canadian performance, regional prospects remain strong. Potential output of Asian nations suggests growth can remain well above the developed market average for many years to come. Bookended by regional emerging powerhouses, China and India, Asian economies will most likely see increasing regional demand for their resources, manufacturing output, and large labor forces. And if Canada continues to grow its exports and investment presence at its current rates, we could see trade to Asian nations become a significant share of our exports, possibly entering our top 5. And I would just like to highlight an example of how EDC and leveraging EDC and our solutions can help a company along its journey and some of what we do. So in 2017, we sat down and met with a company, a client of ours who had recently acquired a supplier of theirs who had a small operation in Vietnam. So they approached us and they said, we really like what we're seeing from the supplier. We would like to explore this further. So we sat down and we worked with our colleagues in Singapore to understand this particular aspect of the supply chain. Using our trade credit coverage, we did very simple research: name, address, and phone number of their supplier in Vietnam, and we very much like what we saw on the credit output of that particular search. So they doubled down. They engaged very strongly with this supplier. 2 years later, decided to partner with the supplier and establish a joint venture. So not only was it now a supplier, it was a beachhead in Vietnam for this Canadian company, and use this beachhead to not only use it as part of their supply chain, but also expand their customer base in the South, in the Asian markets. So EDC, we are 2.7 billion in total volume activity as of 2020. It was a strong, it's a strong region for us, and one that we're looking to double down and grow on. And we have significant capacity as well. And over the next 10 years, as part of our 20 strategy, Asian region is going to be continue to be a key focus for EDC, and we look forward to engaging with all of you in this room and any companies that you have within your networks looking to establish a presence in the market, expand there, invest, and continue to grow our partnerships in the market.